The race for governor of the state of Maryland. 6 Democratic candidates, 3 of them frontrunners, each fighting for the party nomination in a state where the primary traditionally determines the winner in November. The new governor will face growing social and fiscal challenges, an expanding $39 billion state budget, the failed health exchange, new environmental regulations, and the rising cost of education. Different visions from a diverse field of candidates. Tonight, they square off in the Fox 45 Town Hall debate before you head to the polls to express your voice, your future. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Gilbert from Fox 45 News, and I will be your moderator this evening. We have 2 candidates for governor debating this evening, Attorney General Doug Gansler and State Delegate Heather Mazier. You will also notice there is an empty lectern on the stage. We invited Lieutenant Governor Anthony Brown to be a part of this debate tonight. In fact, we negotiated with his campaign for several months to secure his appearance here this evening. But ultimately, the Lieutenant Governor chose not to be a part of the only Baltimore-produced televised debate. We believe that this debate will be a key part of helping voters to decide when they go to the voting booth on June 24th, don't miss the date, for the primary. We believe this is an important night for Baltimore voters, and we appreciate Attorney General Gansler and State Delegate Mazier for being here and for your willingness to share your visions for the state with the people of the greater Baltimore area. So thank you. We're going to begin by going over the rules for the evening. Each candidate will have 60 seconds to respond to my questions. In addition, they will each have the opportunity to do 3 rebuttals or 3 challenges, and those will each last for 30 seconds. We've also taken questions from the public tonight, from Twitter and from Facebook, and I will be asking those questions throughout the hour-long program. You can also, of course, comment about the debate on Twitter. We are using the hashtag tonight, Your Voice, Your Future. You can see we also have a studio audience. These are guests invited by the Gansler and Mazier campaigns. We thank you for being with us, but we ask that you remain silent throughout the program, with the exception of right now, as we welcome our 2 candidates for the evening. Again, thanks to both of you for being here. Thanks for coming to the great city of Baltimore. It is a great city. We know it's a great city, but all too often we find ourselves the brunt of some really ugly jokes on the national stage because of the terrible problems and the challenges that we do have here. Just last week, Stephen Colbert referred to us as an uninhabitable wasteland, and we hate to hear that, obviously. We also know that in recent years, much of the political clout in Maryland has really shifted more toward the D.C. suburbs. Both of you come to us from Montgomery County, and we know that a lot of people here in Baltimore want to know, what will you do for Baltimore? And Delegate Mazier, you won the coin toss. We'll begin with you.
Thank you so much for the question, Jennifer, and thank you to the audience that's joining us this evening. It's a really critical question about what we need to do to help Baltimore City moving forward. Here are some of my ideas. I was instrumental in engaging with advocates to get the first $1 billion of school construction funding in Baltimore City, and I have a plan to make sure that Phase 2 funding comes forward. The only way we're going to encourage 50,000 more families to move to Baltimore City is by revitalizing our neighborhoods, and our schools are the anchors of these neighborhoods. I want to make sure that we have a 21st century classroom for all of our children. We're going to continue investing in the Port of Baltimore. Do you know that $1.7 billion of economic activity is generated from the Port of Baltimore every year? That's 5 times the amount of money that any city earns from hosting a Super Bowl. We're going to not just raise the minimum wage, but have a living wage, and I have a plan to provide middle-class tax cuts that Baltimore is desperately seeking.
Thank you, Delegate Mazier. Attorney General Gansler, what will you do for Baltimore?
Well, thank you. I work in Baltimore every day. I've been coming to Baltimore since I was a Birds fan as a young boy when Brooks Robinson, Frank Robinson, and Boog Powell were playing. And I love this city. This city has an amazing amount of potential, though it needs jobs. 46% of the adults in Baltimore City are unemployed. We have the second highest and worst minority achievement gap in the country, and it's felt nowhere more strongly than right here in Baltimore. We have a rampant crime problem with over 250 to 300 people murdered every year now, going on well over a decade. So there's a lot to do. And I'm somebody that gets things done. I've been in public service for 22 years. I'm seeing problems, seeing things that are unfair, seeing things that need to be fixed, working relentlessly to get things done. I'll give you an example in Baltimore. I still play lacrosse. I coach both my sons in lacrosse. I've been coaching for 30 years. I noticed that Baltimore City had no opportunity for lacrosse in the city. So 6 years ago, I started a program called Charm City Youth Lacrosse. We now have over 400 boys and girls playing every Saturday morning in Carroll Park. I go every Saturday. I bring my children, and it's been a huge success mentoring these children and make them part of the fabric of Baltimore City.
Thank you, Attorney General. We know that a recent Gallup poll said that 47% of people in Maryland say they'd like to leave the state. Another Gallup poll shows that 67% believe that taxes are too high. Attorney General Gansler, what will you do about taxes, and what will you do to make sure that people don't vote with their feet and move elsewhere?
And it's really sad because, look, I grew up in Maryland. I'm the only candidate that did. It's such a great state, and they've increased taxes under Lieutenant Governor Brown and the O'Malley administration over 40 straight times. We've had tax increases. They want to balance the economic future of our state on the back of more taxes and casino gambling. We've lost over 8,000 small businesses in the last 8 years. We have 67% more people unemployed than there were 8 years ago. We have 4 Fortune 500 companies left in Maryland. You know, people get it. We're 49th in personal income growth in the state. So we have a real problem in terms of our taxes, and we have to be competitive with our neighboring states. One of the things I called for is a reduction in the corporate tax. It's 8.25. Virginia's is 6. West Virginia's is 6.5. We need to continue to, by a quarter of a point each year, reduce our corporate tax so we can bring hundreds of millions of dollars back into the tax base of Maryland by bringing more businesses back here and fewer businesses leaving here.
And before I have Delegate Mazier respond, I just want to ask you, Attorney General, because I know the Lieutenant Governor has gone back and forth with you on this. What is the cost of reducing that corporate tax rate?
Yeah, the Lieutenant Governor's been nice enough to send 2 very nasty negative advertisements to everybody that's going to vote in Maryland, and using the number that's going to cost $1.6 billion to reduce the tax number. Well, look, 6% of something is a lot more than 8.25 of nothing. And the problem is we have to recognize that we're losing all our companies. President Obama, Chris Van Hollen, Steny Hoyer, all of them have called for reduction of the corporate tax because people are going to walk with their feet, as you said. Look, if somebody's looking to have a company here and the tax rate is 8.25 and they can go to Northern Virginia at 6, they're going to pick 6 every time. And that's jobs, and that's increasing our tax base, and that's putting people back to work.
Delegate Mazier, what will you do about taxes, and what will you do to encourage people to stay in this state?
There's a defining difference in this election on tax policy. I'm not someone that is pushing for corporate tax cuts. I'm going to be the governor for middle-class families. If we bring back the millionaire's tax, which was allowed to expire in this current administration, we would have enough revenue to give 90% of all Maryland families tax relief that they need. That's money that gets reinvested in our economy. We buy more shoes and school supplies for our children. We go out to dinner more often. But I also am investing meaningful tax relief in our small businesses. They're the job creators and the backbones of our economy. By closing one corporate tax loophole that allows a handful of multi-state corporations that avoid paying their taxes here in Maryland, asking them to pay their fair share, we could give $200 million of small business tax relief. I want to see thriving small businesses just like 36th Street in Hamden and here in Baltimore all across this state. And we will do it by giving small businesses tax cuts and middle-class families tax relief to shop in those businesses.
Delegate Mazier, the point was brought up earlier about the number of Fortune 500 companies in this state, and with the acquisition of Constellation Energy, Baltimore became the largest city in the nation without a Fortune 500 company. Some governors in other states have taken very active roles, almost PR campaigns, to try to draw businesses into the state. Is that a role that you would take on, and how would you sweeten the deal here in Maryland when Maryland does have a reputation of having taxes that are too high and too many regulations that make it not business friendly?
Jennifer, let's set the record straight on the corporate tax policy. Maryland has the second lowest corporate tax rate in the region, but I would agree that we can do a lot more to help businesses understand how to operate with certainty by getting our regulations under control. Let me give you one example. 3 years ago, I wanted to figure out how we could do more composting in our state, but large industrial composting facilities wouldn't operate here because we had 3 agencies with 3 different sets of rules and regulations on how they should operate. I worked with that private sector industry advocates and those agency officials to rewrite the law so that there was one set of rules, one streamlined regulation that said Maryland's open for business. And as a result, an independent report came out saying that 1,400 new green economy jobs are on their way to Maryland because of that regulatory policy that we changed. I will bring that kind of dedication to every regulatory policy in Maryland to help us grow more jobs and let businesses know we're open for business here in Maryland under a Messier Coates administration.
Attorney General Gansler, I'll let you respond to the question of, would you take that active role of going out and seeking businesses to come here as some other governors have done?
Yeah, I think it's the most important and defining part of this campaign, that we're for jobs. I believe the middle class is getting squeezed, and I believe that the reason why it's important that we have Fortune 500 companies here in Baltimore and in Maryland is because people in Druid Hill and Reservoir Hill and Shipley Hill and Cherry Hill all need to have a place to work. And if we don't have these companies coming back here, if they continue to leave, we just learned McCormick's thinking about leaving our state. And each week or each month we hear about another company leaving the state. And that means we have an increasing tax base that we keep taxing more. And so that's a big problem for us. Yes, we need to be active, and that starts at the top. First, you have to recognize there's a problem. And so what we need to do is things like New York. We've now fallen to 46th in the country in manufacturing. New York has said, look, we'll give you tax credits if you're going to bring your manufacturing plant to our state and give hundreds of jobs to people. We need to do that in Maryland, and we need to have a real competitive nature with the other states that are around us.
Our next question comes to us from Laura on Twitter, and she asked the question, how will you secure the weak Maryland pension fund from further raids to balance the state budget? Attorney General Gansler.
Well, I'm glad it wasn't Laura, my wife, because she's sitting here, so I know that wasn't her doing that. But listen, I think we have to protect our pensions. You know, they make promises. The Brown-O'Malley administration has made promises. They said they were going to protect $300 million. They tried to get down to $100 million and settled on $200 million. That's taking money from the people of Maryland. And we have to have dedicated funds. Look at all the money we're making in casino gambling that was supposed to go to expanding pre-K from half-day to full-day. I was the first candidate running for governor by 6 months to say we need to expand pre-K around the state to every child, have a voluntary pre-K for all children throughout the state. Though I did say we need to start with people at 300% above the poverty line and below to address this egregious minority achievement gap, which is the moral stain of our state. But we need to protect the pensions. We need to protect the Transportation Trust Fund. What they did was they said, you know, we're going to raid all the money from the Transportation Trust Fund, and now we're going to have another regressive tax and have a gas tax. We need to protect the money of the people of Maryland.
Delegate Messier, what would you do about the pension fund situation?
Laura, thank you so much for posing that question to us. It's a really important one because we've seen pensions get raided too often in Annapolis. First, it was our teachers. We shifted the pension obligation from the state to the counties for our teachers. I fought against that. I voted against that plan because it was not only bad for our educators, it was bad for our first responders, our police officers, and our firefighters in counties where that money was going to get shifted and a new obligation on them. This last legislative session, I fought against and voted against the nearly $300 million pension cut from our state employees. This was done right after we asked our employees, state employees, just 2 years ago to pay more into their pensions so that we would have a pension fund that was fully funded. And we raided that extra money to close budget gaps. Promises made need to be promises kept on pensions. I know this at a very personal level. My father was a United Auto worker for 32 years, and after he retired, his pension was also raided by his company and had a hard time making ends meet. I will be the governor that fights to protect your pensions. We won't go for cheap and easy tricks for balancing the budget under a Messier administration.
We want to switch topics now to the topic of crime. Just this past weekend in Baltimore, we saw 6 shootings, 3 of them fatal. Baltimore, the 7th most violent city in the country. Delegate Messier, as governor, what would you do to make Baltimore safer?
First of all, my heart goes out to everyone in the city who has been ravaged by these crimes. We saw 540 shootings in Baltimore last year. That's 1.5 a day. Maryland ranks as the 9th most violent state in the nation. We have to change this. No mother should be worried about sending her children to a school bus stop and whether or not they are going to be shot, or being able to shop in a mall or go to a movie theater. We have to reject that this is the new normal. I have a plan to make sure that Maryland becomes the 7th state that does truly universal background checks on all firearms. I want us to remove firearms from the scenes of domestic violence disturbances because women are 5 times more likely to be killed when their abuser has a firearm in the home. And we know that gun buyback programs work really well at getting those extra guns off the streets and out of the hands of violent criminals. But we haven't invested enough money to make those programs exist all across the state, and my plan for criminal justice reform does that.
Attorney General Gansler.
I've been a prosecutor for the last 22 years. I was an assistant United States attorney in the Clinton administration. I was the state's attorney in Montgomery County. I've been your attorney general for the last 8 years fighting crime. We don't need plans. We can get this done. There are so many things that we need to do. We need to, I pushed and got the first gang statute in the state of Maryland. We need to actually expand that to have a statewide RICO statute so we can get the gangs off the streets in Baltimore City. There are 3 types of people you don't want to have guns in their hands. People with convicted felons, domestic violence issues, and mental health issues. I put the first domestic violence dockets in place in Montgomery County, then the second. And then I passed laws as head of the Family Violence Council to make sure we took guns out of the hands of domestic violence abusers. I think we ought to have the same law that we have in the federal system and the state system, which is a 5-year mandatory minimum for any convicted felon who's walking around the streets with a gun. I prosecuted the Georgian diplomat that killed the girl in DuPont Circle. I prosecuted the snipers. I went to the Supreme Court of the United States myself and argued in front of them to keep a sex offender in jail. I'm looking forward to protecting the state of Maryland as your governor.
Delegate Mazier, I know that you have advocated for the legalization of marijuana. We know that we will have decriminalization of marijuana in this state. So whether it is full-on legalization or decriminalization, what does that message does it send to our kids? And how does it complicate the already complicated discussions that we have with our children as we try to set boundaries about what's right, what's wrong, what's okay, and what isn't? Attorney General Gansler, we'll begin with you.
Well, I'm for medical marijuana. I think if a real doctor is going to thinks that someone should be prescribed marijuana because it'll help them in hospice or what have you, I think that's important to do as long as we have it administered by real doctors. Decriminalization was the next step, and I don't have a problem with that because the reality was that the amount of marijuana that we're talking about of possession, people really don't go to jail, certainly not when I'm prosecutor in Montgomery County, they wouldn't. So the issue is whether we want to go to legalization. I'm against going to legalization at this point. I think we may get there someday, but I think we need to let other states experiment with it first, literally and figuratively, because I think that there's a lot of wrinkles to this. I mean, when Colorado put medical marijuana in, for example, something over 90% of the people that had prescription for arthritis were under 26 years old. I mean, we need to make sure that it's put in appropriately and the right way, not because of taxes. We just can't tax our way out of this. It has to be done hand in hand with public health officials and public safety officials. We may get there, but let's make sure if we do it the right way.
Delegate Mazier, why do you believe now is the time to move ahead with full legalization?
Our war on drugs has been a failure. Our marijuana prohibition laws are not working. They've been enforced with racial bias. African Americans and whites use marijuana at the exact same frequency, but African Americans go to jail 3 times more often. It detracts our law enforcement from focusing on more violent and serious crimes. And when we legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana, we take an underground economy and we bring it to the light of day, increasing our opportunity to keep it out of the hands of young people, because drug dealers aren't carding anyone for an ID. The state can do a better job of making sure that it's only adults who have access to this. And for adults, we know that if they're choosing to use this in the privacy of their own home, it should be treated no different than alcohol or tobacco, because it's the similar toxicity and it's no more toxic and no more addictive than those 2 substances, and we should treat it the same. And when we do this, we can generate as much as $160 million of new revenue that I dedicate towards universal pre-K, where we'll finally get to eliminating the achievement gap in our schools. And if I could just use 30 more seconds to address the fact that I don't think we should be waiting. Waiting is what happens when you're not showing leadership. Showing leadership is to say, this is smart policy. We've done our homework. We've done our due diligence. We've read all the reports, and we know that this is the best policy for Maryland. That's why the Mesier-Coates administration is putting this forward, and that's why almost 60% of Maryland families support legalization in Maryland as well.
We have 33,000 people in our prison cells, in our jail cells. We have more than 143,000 people in the system altogether. We spend close to $1 billion a year on the system. If you were elected governor, what would you do to reform our criminal justice and incarceration system? And would you look at commuting the mandatory minimum sentence of nonviolent drug offenders? Delegate Mesier.
Thank you so much for the really, really important question. I believe that for too long we have had an approach in this state that is focused on mass incarceration. We have this cradle to prison pipeline that I fought against when I opposed the youth jail being built here in Baltimore. We know that when we build it, we'll fill it. And we have to stop just being tough on crime. We have to start being smart on crime. My strategies are focused on early intervention and engagement with our youth, stronger sentencing and risk release systems, and focusing on rehabilitation and reentry within the criminal justice system, and connecting people to jobs and housing when they get out so that the recidivism and the revolving door stops turning. We can do this in Maryland with a different approach. And yes, in my criminal justice platform, I've proposed eliminating mandatory minimum sentences across the board.
Attorney General Gansler, how would you reform the system, and would you look at possibly commuting some of those sentences for nonviolent drug dealers?
Well, this is an issue that I started talking about over a year ago, and people thought I was crazy. Why are we talking about people who can't vote by definition? They're in jail. And the fact of the matter is, to your point, we've spent $1.3 billion on this system. Most of the people, of the 23,000 people incarcerated, are coming out, and we spend an awful lot of money on the 144,000 people in our system. We can choose to continue our revolving criminal justice system, where almost 50% go back within 3 years. Or we can do what other states have done, like Virginia, Oregon, Michigan. Michigan was able to close 20 correctional facilities by focusing on the idea of reentry. You know, we can take people from being $33,000 a year inmates behind bars and making them tax-paying citizens. These are real people. These are people with children. These are children of people. They're part of the fabric of the community, and they can contribute. So we need to educate them in jail, let them have the ability to get educated in jail, and then give tax credits to companies willing to take a chance and hire somebody that's just released that wants to make good and can be a productive member of society.
We're going to take this question now from Twitter. This is Jean, who's asking the question, with the poverty rate in Baltimore at 24%, what is your plan for jobs creation to lessen crime and homelessness? Attorney General Gansler.
Well, I think it starts with jobs. If you have the jobs, then you can certainly reduce crime, because there's other opportunities besides selling drugs, and you have money to get a home, so you're not homeless. So we need to really start with jobs. 46% of the adults in Baltimore don't have work. That's where you start. We need to focus on the two areas that we are uniquely qualified, which is life sciences and cybersecurity. We're the only state in the country that has NIH, Johns Hopkins, the #1 hospital in the country the last 21 out of 22 years, as well as the University of Maryland Medical System. We have the Cyber Command Center. We have NSA. We don't capitalize on that. So we need to be able to bring jobs, and those two industries alone are boundless in their potential. We also have the Port of Baltimore, which can be used to a much greater extent. It's one of 2 deep-sea ports in the country that can take the ships from the Panama Canal, and BWI can be expanded for international trade as well. So there's real opportunities that we are not capitalizing on here. I've already talked about manufacturing and the need to bring that in, and of course we need to make our tax structure competitive so jobs will actually come to Maryland.
Delegate Mesier, the question of lessening homelessness and crime and job creation in Baltimore.
Jean, at the heart of your question was about our income inequality gap. And I am focused on addressing this as your governor. I grew up in a working class family, and this has been a cause of a lifetime for me. We're going to do this by, first of all, turning our minimum wage into a living wage. No one should be working 40 hours a week and still live in poverty. We're going to provide middle-class tax relief to 90% of all Maryland families. I won't explain away the gender pay gap that exists in our state. Men and women need to earn the same wage, equal pay for equal work. And I'm also focused on a comprehensive approach to make sure that child care, college costs, and housing are all more affordable for middle-class families. And on homelessness, Utah has put together a very interesting program that's a housing first policy that saves money on the back end on the incarceration, mental health, and healthcare costs by focusing on getting people housing. They've almost eliminated homelessness in Utah. If Utah can do it, Maryland certainly can, and we're going to go down the path of studying the Utah model.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to the topic of education. Statistics last year released by the U.S. Census Bureau showed that in fiscal year 2011, the city of Baltimore spent more than $15,000 per student in that fiscal year. It was the second highest per pupil spending in the country. And yet Baltimore City schools remain among the worst in the nation, consistently in the bottom third. What are we doing wrong? And is throwing money at the problem always the answer? And what will you do, Delegate Mazier, to make sure that a child born in Baltimore City has the same access to quality education as a child born in Montgomery County?
There is a chronic and persistent achievement gap in Maryland schools, and we can address this. It still matters in Maryland what your socioeconomic status is and what your race is to determine whether or not you're going to be successful in school. We know it doesn't have to be this way. When we invest in early childhood education and give every child a chance to enter school ready to learn at the exact same pace, we eliminate those disparities. And so Delman Coates and I have put forward a truly comprehensive approach to early childhood education, one that is a universal pre-K program for 4-year-olds and a half-day for 3-year-olds from working class families. But we don't stop there. From birth until you get into pre-K, we want to make sure that families have access to affordable, nurturing educational environment for their children in child care settings. And we fix and boost up the value of the child care subsidy in our state. And we also put meaningful money behind expanding after-school and summer initiatives for our youth. Taken in total, the Washington Post has called our plan the most ambitious plan to eliminate the achievement gap in our schools, and that's how we're going to get this done, Jennifer.
Thank you, Delegate Mazier. Attorney General Gansler.
I think our achievement gap is the moral stain of our state. The fact that we have the second worst minority achievement gap in the country, which is most felt here in Baltimore, is absolutely incredible to me. That we have in this state, in this time, that we have schools that are in that kind of condition. And so we need to address this. I started the first Civil Rights Division in the Attorney General's office, and I believe this to be the civil rights issue of our time. You know, we can start at the beginning, where I was the first one to call for universal pre-K from half day to full day, because when you show up at school and you have a 3,000 word vocabulary in Baltimore City, say, and to your point, in Montgomery County, you might have an 8,000 to 10,000 word vocabulary, you never catch up. It shouldn't matter what you look like, what zip code you happen to be born in, you should have access to a top quality of education. I called in a television ad, and I've been calling for all along, to have skilled teachers in every classroom. And I was criticized by the Lieutenant Governor for being reckless for that. Can I use my 30 seconds extra? For being reckless, for suggesting the audacity to have skilled teachers in every classroom. Seniority has to be important in that. My Lieutenant Governor, Jolene Ivey, her father, after he was a Buffalo soldier, was a teacher at High Point High School in Prince George's County. My mother's a substitute teacher in Montgomery County. We need to bolster our teachers. We need to support our teachers, because if we have good teachers in every classroom, children can learn. And we need to pay them more. And we need to give them the resources that they need. And at the back end, when you're 16, if you choose to want to do your math and your English in the morning, but do a vocational or career apprenticeship in the afternoon, every child in Maryland should have that opportunity. Let's say you want to be an electrician. It takes 10,000 hours to be certified. In the afternoon, you go through that process so that when you're 18, you have your certification, you have your certificate from school and your certification for a job.
And I want to follow up on that, your ad that talks about skill over seniority in the classroom and getting rid of ineffective teachers. The teachers union very early on endorsed your opponent, the Lieutenant Governor. First of all, how do you get the bad teachers out and keep the good teachers teachers. What is the litmus test for that? Who determines who stays and who goes? And how would you work with the teachers union to make that happen, given that they've endorsed your opponent?
Yeah, everybody's in, all the special interests have a very strong interest in this campaign to endorse the lieutenant governor. That's why if he had spent more money actually running the Affordable Care Act rollout instead of raising money from special interests, we wouldn't be in this condition on the health care situation. On the school situation, however, yes, they've endorsed him. And I believe that the teachers union thinks that teachers, we should have quality teachers in every classroom as well, and seniority ought to be part of that calculus. What they've done in Montgomery County, working with the teachers union, was put in something called PAR, Peer Assessment Review, where the teachers themselves review and determine which teachers are effective and which are ineffective. Teaching to the test and test improvement, that's part of it, but it's got to be more than that. If you went into any school, if you went to Patterson Park High School tomorrow and asked any student or any teacher who are the good teachers and who are the bad teachers, you'd get the same answer. Any school in the state, you'd have that happen. We need to make sure that every student, every child is valuable, and every child should have a valuable and good teacher. We have to support our teachers, not reject them.
Delegate Mazier, what do you say to this concept of skill over seniority and something like the peer assessment review to make those determinations?
I think that our educators are all skillful. We are seeing teachers, nobody goes into this profession to get rich. They're all in the classroom because they care deeply about our children and want to help them succeed. And we don't always give policies in the classroom that help them do that. I met an educator in Howard County earlier this year who said when she's in front of the classroom and teaching those students, there is nothing she would rather be doing in this world. But when she has to deal with the administrative burdens and the high-stakes testing culture, she is very frustrated and thinking about leaving the profession entirely. And I could tell that it had broken her spirit. She wants, and I want, classrooms where we are encouraging our children to excel at loving learning and not just being good at memorizing answers for tests. If we come together and empower our educators, pay them what they deserve, and have approaches to education reform that are about focusing on our success of our children and not just a high-stakes testing culture, I think that we will be a lot more successful in the long run in our classrooms.
Do you support some sort of performance evaluation for teachers?
Absolutely. We have performance evaluations already in place. The problem right now is, as we have shifted to a new curriculum in the classroom, there's a mismatch between the exams that the children are taking. They don't match the curriculum that they're being taught. And so I do support a moratorium on not using those evaluations to penalize teachers until we get that fully implemented. But we have the tools in place to continue to evaluate and hold our teachers accountable, and it's working.
The topic of Common Core, we know that it has been controversial across the country and here in Maryland. Delegate Mazier, do you support Common Core, and do you believe that it allows enough flexibility for local control in the classroom?
I think that this issue of transitioning to Common Core is one that is a really good example of how we need governors who will have foresight and long-term thinking about what it takes to implement challenging new policies in our state. We have had an incredibly sloppy transition to Common Core. Educators got the standards and guidelines very late in the school system. They weren't given the resources and the tools necessary to develop the curriculum around those standards in time. I just discussed the mismatch between the exam and what the children are being assessed. It's very frustrating. Parents and teachers and educators alike are frustrated. But let's not lose sight that within Common Core, there's a very great opportunity to get our children the skill set that they need to be successful in a 21st century economy. That's focused on critical skills, practical thinking, critical thinking that will help our students compete in an innovation economy. And what we have to do is stay on top of this to make sure that it works and implement reforms along the way to keep making it be better and better along the way.
Attorney General Gansler, your position on Common Core.
I agree with Delegate Mazier that it's been very clumsy, the implementation of Common Core, but we are going to get there because it's funding driven. And I do believe that we ought to have more localized control over our schools. I mean, the problem we have, one of the problems we have right now is you come out of college, you're 22 years old, and 3 years later you get tenure. at 25. And where does the incentive go for the teachers to continue to grow and expand and be rewarded? We ought to have more control with the principals in the schools to do things like, for example, I think financial literacy ought to be taught to our children. I was the president of the National Association of Attorneys General. I was elected by my peers, Republican and Democrat, to head that organization. And we went after the major banks because of mortgage foreclosures. And a lot of people just didn't have the literacy in the financial realm to understand what was going on there. Or cybersecurity and cyberbullying, and make sure that we have internet safety taught in our schools. So there's so much more that we can do. The Common Core is the base, but I think we ought to be more innovative and actually get to our students. I had Miss Kopp, I had Miss Hanrahan. They were great teachers. They both live in Maryland, and we all ought to think about those great teachers that we had to make us want to be successful in life.
Our last question on this topic, not necessarily the most pressing issue in education today, but I can tell you based on our Facebook page last week, a lot of people care about this. Do you support starting school after Labor Day? Attorney General Gansler.
You know, it's an interesting issue for a governor whether we start after Labor Day. I do support the concept. I'd have to, get involved in whether or not it makes sense. I mean, as long as you have the requisite amount of days, it seems to make sense to start after Labor Day. For the for the economy of the state and also for consistency for all the students, and it would be kind of when you're going to start school. But I'm much more concerned rather than when you start or finish the school year to make sure that while you're there every day, what goes on inside the classrooms is something that is exciting for the students. They want to be there. They're engaged. They're not being given a fish. They're learning how to fish, and I think that's absolutely critical for all the students. But look, as a general concept, I think it's a good idea. It's something that I would put the experts in the education field together in a room and determine whether it makes sense or not from a state perspective.
Delegate Mazier, starting school after Labor Day?
Well, the reason why this question was taken up to begin with was the thought that if we wait until after Labor Day, you can save money in the school system. You generate more tax revenue for the state because more families are able to go to Ocean City for Labor Day weekend, for example. And I think that's an interesting concept, but needs to remain a local issue. We have to do more to continue to protect the decisions being driven at the local level related to how we're going to make our education policy. That's some of how we got into trouble with Common Core to begin with. We went after federal funding with strings attached without exactly stopping to think through what the implementation and challenges would be to that. We have to start with a local first approach to education because no one is ever going to know how to best educate our children than the local teachers and their and the children's parents themselves. And that local collaboration is what has to be protected. And I think this needs to be a local driven decision, not one that is made by the governor.
Switching topics now to the issue of health care, and we certainly wish the Lieutenant Governor were here for, at least for this first question. We would like to know who should be held accountable for the disastrous rollout of the state health exchange. But I will ask each of you, more importantly, what does that accountability actually mean? And more importantly, if you're governor, what would you do differently going forward? Delegate Mazier.
Thank you for the question. My entire life, I have believed that health care is a right and not a privilege. I supported the components of the Affordable Care Act for years before it was advanced at the federal level because I was trying to get those same policies passed here in Maryland. The first piece of legislation that I passed as a legislator was a bill that allows young adults to stay on their family's health plans through age 25. That's now federal law because we showed in Maryland how it works first. And with all of my experience in implementing health care, whether it was finding a unique way to enroll 50,000 more children into health insurance, or working across the aisle to give thousands of women access to free family planning services. In each instance, I found that it wasn't just passing the law that mattered. It was the unglamorous side of governing that actually mattered, that how we implement these laws are most important. Our ideas and our vision matter in this election, but our track records for implementing laws successfully matter more, and I have that track record on health care. I'm the governor that you want to make sure that we continue to move forward in a positive way, connecting people with the health insurance they need and deserve in our state. Mr.
Gansler, what does accountability mean, and what would you do different going forward?
Well, I agree with Delegate Missouri that health care is a right. And I ran President Obama's campaign here in Maryland, along with Elijah Cummings. And I think President Obama, with the Affordable Care Act, whether you like the Affordable Care Act or not like the Affordable Care Act, he made America, which was the only industrialized country in the world that did not provide health care to its citizens, through the Affordable Care Act. We have that now. I then went to the Supreme Court of the United States and had Maryland as the lead plaintiff state there to say, yes, it's constitutional, let's get it done. Then we go to accountability. Yes, the lieutenant governor couldn't quite make it tonight. He couldn't make it in front of the committees that were investigating it. He wouldn't turn over his emails talking about accountability. Right now, he says we're the leader in healthcare rollout. Well, it's been a national embarrassment. You know, we had 67,000 people enroll, almost all of whom did not enroll on the website, which we paid almost $200 million of taxpayer money to set up. And then the question is, where do we go now? Now they're going to chase good money after bad and go to Connecticut instead of the federal system, which will be free and available tomorrow.
Do you believe that we should go to that federal system?
I've been calling for us to go to the federal system for months. It doesn't cost us any money. It works. At the tune of 50,000 people a day were able to enroll in the Maryland Exchange or the state exchange. They would be able to enroll in the Maryland Exchange through the federal system. And then when we get to the middle of November for the open enrollment period again, we would be ready to go and people could change once we got the Maryland system to work. The problem with Connecticut is they went into a closed room again, no competition, no transparency, and decided to spend another $40 or $50 million to try and retrofit Connecticut's system into Maryland's, and even the Connecticut people say that's not going to work. So we need to know what went wrong to be able to fix the problem, and the lieutenant governor has been ducking that issue, and the people have a right to know what happened to their money, and there's real people, children and parents and grandparents, who don't have access to health care, hundreds of thousands as a result.
Thank you, Attorney General. I just want to let you jump in, Delegate Mazier, on this question of whether we should cut our losses and move on and go to the federal exchange.
My concern about going to the federal exchange is that they've worked out some of the kinks, but that program works best for people in the private insurance market. It's still not working very well for states to get their Medicaid populations enrolled. And our Medicaid families are our most vulnerable in the state. They're low-income families that desperately need access to health care as well. Our best option is to continue to fix and do a state-based model to help our low-income families get access. And I think that along the way, we have to push through some important policy changes. The federal government allows us right now to take anyone who qualifies for food stamps and make them automatically eligible for Medicaid, but we're not doing that in Maryland. It also allows us to give families an opportunity to stay enrolled for an entire year rather than checking their income calculations every 4 months and throwing them off health care. We should be doing these things, and my focus is to make sure that we fix it and get it right in Maryland for everyone, at the income scales at the top all the way down to the bottom.
Can I have my 30-second? Yeah, you know, the reason why this is so important in this particular debate with Delegate Missouri and myself, and Delegate Missouri has been critical of the lieutenant governor as well, this is the only thing that the lieutenant governor has been asked to run or manage in his tenure as lieutenant governor. I've been running government agencies for 16 years. I've been elected 4 times to do so, and have balanced the budget every year and gotten things done and saw problems and fixed them. The problem here is the lieutenant governor wouldn't even apologize to the people of Maryland, the people who need diabetes tests, they need heart transplants or what have you. He said people were inconvenienced. It's not an inconvenience if your child needs to get chemotherapy and you can't do it because the website didn't work.
Thank you. We have a doctor shortage in this country already, and it's projected to get much worse over the next 10 years. We know that many physicians are going to a concierge model where you pay a retainer fee to get service from that doctor. How do we make sure that while we have more people getting access or are covered under the Affordable Care Act, that people have access and that we don't have this system of have and have-nots when it comes to getting access to quality care? Delegate Mazier.
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that it's not just doctors who provide health care. Nurses, nurse midwives, alternative medicine practitioners. We have a lot of health care providers in our state, but you're right. As we give more people access to additional health insurance coverage, we have to make sure that those shortages across the board are addressed. And we are projected to need 120,000 more health professionals in Maryland over the next 5 years as this implementation of the Affordable Care Act continues to move forward. I've proposed that we realign our curriculum at our colleges, community colleges, and universities to better take into account what jobs are Maryland's 21st century economy creating, and so that we're aligning the curriculum to produce a skilled workforce that will match that. I also would double down on Maryland's investment in a successful federal program that's called the National Health Service Corps that encourages providers to go into low-income communities and areas where there is no access to a health care provider and to get meaningful relief on their student loans as a result of making that choice.
Attorney General Gansler, what do we do to make sure that people have access to quality care?
Well, right now we have a system of haves and have-nots. There's hundreds of thousands of people in Maryland who don't have access to health care because we were not able to get a website up and running, and that is what the most unfortunate part of it is. Look, you know, economics, if you build it, they will come. There will be more and more doctors as more and more people need health care. In fact, the enrollment has gone up year after year in the last few years at medical schools in Maryland and throughout the country. I think Delegate Missouri touched on a good point, which is Maryland has the second highest amount of student debt for students coming out of school, and they're going to be more resistant to continuing to go on to medical school if their debts continue, their student loan debts continue to rise and rise over time. So we need to address that issue by making sure that, yes, it's good to keep the cap on tuition, but more importantly, we need to make sure that every student, regardless of their economic status, can stay in school so they can go on to medical school to become medical professionals. So I think that that'll happen if in Gansler-Ivey administration.
We want to move on to the environment now, and our first question comes to us from Facebook, from Kevin Morgan, who writes, where do you stand on the rain tax, and what, if anything, would you do to change it? Kevin Morgan referring to the stormwater management fee. Attorney General Gansler, where do you stand on it?
Well, I've been the Environmental Attorney General of Maryland, and many people have said that we've done more for the environment during my tenure as Attorney General than any Attorney General in United States history, and that is because of we've had the biggest air pollution settlement in the country, biggest water pollution settlement in the history of Maryland, biggest asbestos settlement here. We're really going after polluters and changing the climate here in Maryland. I was able to push through legislation to get phosphorus out of dishwasher detergent, give standing to environmental groups. You know, a number of issues each year that we take up on the environmental front. We've been doing river audits for 8 years, every 3 months, going around the state. We've had 24 of them to look at issues that are ubiquitous and peculiar to a particular rivershed, because we need to clean the rivers, the creeks, and the tributaries. So while the rain tax is one of the 40 taxes that the Brown-O'Malley administration has levied upon the citizens of Maryland, I think we need to look at our tax structure as a competitive nature with the other states around us to make sure that we're not just taxing businesses, but we're taxing everybody.
30 seconds or less, Attorney General Gansler, would you look at repealing the rain tax?
I'm not looking at repealing any of the 40 or 50 taxes that they've raised. I'm looking to make our state competitive with our neighboring states. So the problem that the rain tax is it's levied against companies and small businesses. We've lost over 8,000 small businesses in the last 8 years, and we don't want to give them another reason to go, but we need to look at it and make sure that our tax structure makes us competitive with our neighboring states, and that it's not too expensive to retire here or too expensive to die here as well. So we want to make sure that we become competitive.
Delegate Mizir, will give you 90 seconds to answer the question of where you stand on the rain tax and whether you would do anything to change it.
Thank you. Our Chesapeake Bay is the most precious natural resource that we have in Maryland, and we have to make it our top environmental priority to keep it clean. Just in the last week, a new report card came out that showed that the health of the Bay ranks at a C. That's not a grade any of us are satisfied with. It's a slight improvement over previous years before we had a stormwater management fee in place. There are 3 ways that we keep the Bay clean. One is by making sure we address our stormwater management, one is wastewater management, and the third is agricultural runoff. And we're starting to see slight improvements in every area except for the area we haven't addressed, which is the agricultural pollution runoff. We have to do that. In this last report, the number of streams and rivers whose pollution has increased as a result of the agricultural pollution has gone up dramatically. That means we have to not only keep our stormwater management fees in place, we have to come up with solutions and proposals related to our agricultural runoff, having more cover crops in place. I am someone who comes from an agricultural family. My grandparents and 4 generations before them were farmers. My wife and I are fortunate to have a small farm on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And I'm also an environmentalist, someone that is endorsed by the Sierra Club to bridge the gap in this conversation between environmentalists and the agricultural community to get this done. But we also need to increase our oyster populations in the Bay. One adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day in the Bay. They've just been overfished. If we bring in more oysters, they can help naturally clean up the bay. I want to preserve and protect more bayside land conservation as well. We all have a stake to play in keeping our bay clean, and under Mizzier Coates administration, we'll put forward the environmental practices to make it happen.
Thank you, Delegate Mizzier. I know you have also been an opponent of fracking, and we are now waiting on the results of a study as this moratorium exists in Maryland on fracking. Would you be at all open to the idea of allowing fracking in Maryland, depending on the results of that study?
I was proud to lead the charge in Maryland to make sure that we didn't frack first and ask questions later like every other state in our region, to disastrous consequences. Flammable tap water, livestock falling over dead from their exposure to toxic chemicals in the wells, increased earthquake activities. I wanted to make sure that science dictates our fracking future and that we put this moratorium in place until we were able to determine what's the impact on the environment, on public health, and on our economies before we ever set a drill in the ground. It's going to be up to the next governor that makes this decision, and you want an environmentalist governor making that call. I'm proud to have led the charge on this. I am incredibly engaged in this issue, and will make sure that we don't put any drill in Maryland that would sacrifice our public health, our environment, or the economies of Western Maryland.
Attorney General Gansler, are you open to the idea of allowing fracking?
Yes, but depending on the study. If it comes back and we can show that hydraulic fracturing, which is horizontal and not just vertical, comes back and it's safe for our drinking water, that we know it's 100% safe, of course we're for it. It's here, it's local, it's free, it's cheap. We can reduce our dependency on foreign oil. We can reduce our dependency on coal. For example, I sued a company called American Electric Power with other attorneys general in the Northeast region. We had a $4.6 billion settlement because they were their 14 coal-burning power plants that were putting soot into the air that was coming over our state. And we have some of the worst air quality in the country. 14 of the 50 worst air quality jurisdictions in the country are here in Maryland. We have the highest amount of lung disease as a result of air pollution. So we want to reduce our dependency on coal, but only if it's safe. So if a report comes back and we can get natural gas here cheap and clean and not sacrifice our drinking water, yes.
Proponents of the expanded Cove Point facility for liquefied natural gas say that it will add jobs, it will add tens of millions of dollars in tax revenue, and really raise Maryland's profile internationally as an exporter. It has the support, for example, of Democratic Congressman Steny Hoyer. Do you support the expansion at Cove Point, Attorney General?
Yeah, so FERC did a study, and we were waiting for the study to make sure that the environmental impact was going to be such that it was, which says that it's safe to build an environmentally friendly way. Cove Point is already there. This is just an expansion. They've already been importing liquefied natural gas. This is just about the ability to export liquefied natural gas. And so now that the report has come back and that it's clean and safe, I think most Marylanders are for it. We need the jobs. If they don't put it here, they're going to put it somewhere else. The people in the community are for it. I think it's important that we continue to bring jobs here to Maryland, to employ people that are otherwise unemployed, and to help the economy. So I think it's great that we're going to be able to go forward with this multi-billion-dollar project.
Delegate Mizzier, do you support the expansion at Cove Point?
Absolutely not. Maryland has 3,000 miles of coastline. It makes us more susceptible to harm from the effects of climate change than almost any other state in the nation. We have to make sure that for example, when Hurricane Sandy came through with a 5-foot tidal surge, Crisfield was wiped out practically. We see Smith and Tangier Islands slipping away every day. To build the liquefied natural gas export facility would create more carbon pollution in our state than all 7 of our coal-fired power plants combined. It would turn Maryland into an international sacrifice zone for fracked gas from all over the country. It would increase our tanker traffic, our pipelines, the liquefiers. This would be really bad for the environment. No governor from Maryland can claim to be for addressing climate change and for this Cove Point facility in the same breath. And if I could use another 30 seconds, I'd also like to address the jobs issue. If Dominion Power from Virginia were to invest the same amount of money in helping us expand our investments in alternative energy in Maryland, if they just helped us double solar and put that same investment in solar jobs in our state, it would be 7,500 new solar industry energy jobs, as opposed to less than 200 jobs related to the liquefied natural gas plant. What this is a plant that is good for oil and gas companies, and it's really bad for Maryland. We have to say no to Cove Point and yes to clean energy.
Thank you, Delegate Mazier. The time has come for our closing statements, and according to the coin toss, the first closing statement is Attorney General Gansler.
Thank you. The issue in this campaign is jobs and the need to deliver for the middle class. Over 40 new taxes in the past 8 years have driven jobs to Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond. We need jobs. The middle class is being squeezed. This was brought home to me here in Baltimore when I met Jerry Seary and Robert Price. They worked at Bethlehem Steel for over 40 years. Their jobs helped them support their families and build a good middle-class life. At its peak, Bethlehem Steel employed over 30,000 people. 2 years ago, they laid off the last 1,900 steel workers. 2 months ago, that steel plant was demolished. It's a story that's repeated across Maryland. Jobs leaving, jobs not coming, families hurt. Maryland deserves better. My wife and I are raising 2 wonderful boys. I want for them what you want for your children, a good job that lets them build a life right here. I remember those workers from Bethlehem Steel. It is for them and their children that I will stand strong, because what Maryland needs is a change, not more taxes. What Maryland needs is jobs.
Delegate Mazier.
Thank you, Jennifer, to our studio audience and everyone at home watching tonight. When I was 9 years old, my father and his union co-workers weren't getting paid fair wages, so they went on strike. And 6 months later, they negotiated themselves a pay raise. Getting what's fair takes more than words. It takes action. The middle class is struggling in Maryland. Child care costs eating up entire paychecks, rising utility bills, skyrocketing housing costs, and increased tax burdens. It's getting harder and harder to meet the bare necessities. Yet, it's hard to find a real champion for the middle class in Annapolis. The current administration raised our taxes while giving handouts to big corporations and the wealthiest few. They slashed child care subsidies and waited for an election year to address flat wages. We deserve better. I'll cut taxes for 90% of Maryland families and seniors, and I'll turn the minimum wage into a living wage. It's time for results. I'm Heather Mazier, and I ask for your vote on June 24th so we can get back to work rebuilding our middle class. Thank you very much.
And we would also like to point out that there are 3 additional Democratic candidates on the ticket, and we will be extending invitations to them to appear on a future newscast on Fox 45. Thank you for joining us for this debate tonight. We hope that you gained valuable information over the past hour to help you make your decision on June 24th. Thank you, Delegate Mazier. Thank you, Attorney General Gansler, for being with us tonight. As a reminder, we will be putting the debate on our website. It is foxbaltimore.com. so you can watch it again. I'm Jennifer Gilbert. For everyone here at Fox 45 News, have a great night.